Not too long ago, I did a live stream and somebody asked me if I've ever cried while researching a case. I'm not much of a crier, so the answer is no. But sometimes I do cover some cases that are so upsetting that they stick in my head for days after I cover them, such as James Bulger, Katie Ruff, Emily Jones, and this. This is definitely one of those cases too. This case takes place on the 9th of December 2009 in Oregon, USA, but it spans over a couple of years too. At around 8 p.m. that night, a woman named Angela McAnulty called 911 from her home and stated that she needed an ambulance right away because her 15-year-old daughter was no longer breathing. When the paramedics arrived, they were shocked to discover that the child was 15 years old, as her body was so small and emaciated. The girl's name was Jeanette Maples. Her hair was wet, she wasn't wearing a top, and she had no pulse. When the paramedics asked what had happened here, Angela claimed that she had simply fallen down, and that she seemed to be fine an hour before she collapsed. But when they inspected Jeanette's body closer, the paramedics were even more disturbed at what they found. Angela was a 41-year-old woman who was raising 3 children. Each of those children had different fathers, but Angela had a total of 5 kids. 2 of them were still in foster care. People who knew Angela described her as a controlling person who seemed to isolate her children on purpose. Jeanette and her 2 brothers were put into foster care in 1995 because Angela and her husband were incarcerated for drug offences. After her 2 sons grew up, they wrote a letter to the family court judge overseeing their case, begging to stay in foster care. Unfortunately, Jeanette wasn't so lucky, and after 5.5 years in foster care, she was made to go back to her mother in 2001. And as soon as she regained custody of her child, she began to physically and mentally abuse her. In 2002, Angela married a man named Richard McAnulty. He was a long-haul trucker and wasn't around too often because of his job. He was described as a rather unintelligent man who would often hand over his hard-earned money to Angela, with almost no questions asked. The 2 of them also had a son together, and in 2005, the couple along with their children moved to Eugene in Oregon. And by 2006, Jeanette began studying in Cascade Middle School in the middle of her 6th grade year. Some of the children made fun of her, as Angela sent her to school in a dirty yellow t-shirt and old sweatpants. Despite the name-calling and the bullying about her clothes and appearance, Jeanette appeared to enjoy school, and although she was rather quiet, she did manage to make a number of friends, and she developed a passion for writing and reading poetry, and she took her education very seriously and spent most of her time tucked away in the school's library. Because of the abuse that she suffered from her mother, she tried her best to hide her injuries, as she feared that if too many people found out, the abuse would intensify. But there were many days when she got changed into her gym clothes and her friends saw the bruises on her abdomen and legs, which she said came from falling. What Jeanette loved most about being at school was that it meant being away from home for a while. Her fellow students said that once the bell would ring, she became noticeably anxious and reserved. For many years, the people who were close to Jeanette tried their best to get the attention of the Child Protective Services. Her step-grandmother was a woman named Lynn McAnulty, and she saw her grandchildren from time to time. She tried twice to report the abuse to the relevant authorities, and a parent of one of Jeanette's friends, along with the teachers at the school, all called the Department of Human Services after Jeanette confided in a friend in the 7th grade, telling her that her mother abused her. The friend had told her parents and school officials about Jeanette's bruises in 2007, and they got in contact with the State Child Welfare Office, but the agency representatives didn't want to act upon what they regarded as second-hand information. The CPS went to the McAnulty home, but they quickly closed the case after Angela denied abusing her daughter and blamed the accusations on Jeanette. She described her own daughter as a compulsive liar, and the CPS went on their way. When Jeanette finished the 8th grade, Angela took her out of school and instead decided to homeschool her. as she was worried that if people continued to raise suspicion of abuse, she could be caught. And now, Jeanette had no escape from the emotional and physical abuse. Her siblings attended school and appeared happy. For some reason, Angela targeted Jeanette only. In October, 2 months before Jeanette would collapse, Lynn McAnulty was briefly allowed inside their home, and when she came inside, she was horrified to find Jeanette facing a wall because she was being punished by her mother. She saw that Jeanette was incredibly emaciated and also had a split lip. Angela used a tired old excuse that she had fallen and that she was facing the wall because she had been misbehaving. Lynn McAnulty left the house and again called the Child Protective Services, begging them to act and do something. This would be the last time she would ever see Jeanette. On the 9th of December, Angela beat her own daughter for the last time. Jeanette's frail body couldn't handle the intense torture anymore, and heartbreakingly, her body gave up on her. The emergency services found Jeanette on her back, topless in a dimly lit living room with extreme cuts and bruises on her face. Jeanette's body was incredibly small for her age due to the lack of nutrition she received, and she was so emaciated that you could pretty much see her bones through her skin. Jeanette had no pulse, but the paramedics desperately tried to save her life. They put a tube in her lungs to assist her in breathing and performed CPR. But despite their best efforts to save this poor girl, she was pronounced dead by the doctors at the hospital upon arrival. Jeanette weighed a shocking 50 pounds and her front teeth were broken, and there were severe wounds on her legs and back. The police would soon uncover the true disturbing reality of what Jeanette had to face on a daily basis. The CPS had failed her. Angela and Richard McAnulty were arrested. Angela initially pinned all the blame on Richard, and when Richard McAnulty was interviewed by the police, they told him that his wife had turned on him. So, he came clean and told them everything about the abuse that Jeanette had suffered at the hands of Angela. He told them that when Jeanette laid on the floor begging for her own mother to stop beating her, Angela would instead beat her even harder, as she considered the begging to be misbehavior. But by confessing to the reality of the situation, he became an accomplice, as he did nothing to stop the torment and torture of Jeanette. The doctor who performed an autopsy on Jeanette said that she was so badly beaten he could not even determine which of the injuries killed her. Jeanette showed signs of prolonged starvation and dehydration, to the point that her muscles had deteriorated and she had a dangerously low body fat percentage. Just being as malnourished and dehydrated as she was could have been fatal, or at least it would have weakened her body to the point where she was unable to recover from the violence she endured. The autopsy also uncovered that Jeanette had bleeding on the brain from extreme blunt force trauma to the head. Richard also said that Jeanette was so desperate for water that she would drink from the toilet or the dog bowl. Angela had taken the faucets off the taps and locked them away so she couldn't drink when she wasn't in. Every cupboard in the house was locked, and only Angela had the keys to open them. The physical abuse I'm about to share is incredibly distressing, so I do warn you before I proceed. Angela beat Jeanette on a regular basis using disturbing methods of abuse and torture. She would turn up the volume of the television to drown out the screams, and she would take Jeanette into her bedroom, that would later be dubbed as the torture room. Once there, she would force Jeanette to take off all of her clothes, and then once she was naked, she would use a belt or a stick to whip her, and even use pliers on her skin. She also forced Jeanette to face the walls with her arms raised above her head for hours and hours at a time. Angela would stomp on her feet regularly, so Jeanette would often be able to only stand on one leg due to the pain of putting pressure on the other one. She would also get her other children to go out and find dog feces from the garden, and she would smear it all over Jeanette's face and force it into her mouth. She would also purposefully beat her in the areas that she had already inflicted extreme injuries to, resulting in the wounds becoming infected. She refused to take her daughter to get any medical treatment, so instead, she took a knife and cut the dead flesh away. Some skin became infected on Jeanette's hips, so Angela took a knife and she cut all the skin off, resulting in her hip bones being fully exposed. Investigators found objects that contained blood and pieces of Jeanette's flesh. After enduring the excruciating torture, Jeanette often had many open cuts and wounds that would bleed, so she was made to sleep on cardboard on the floor so that the blood would not seep into the carpet. The carpet was pulled back by officers, and they found her blood had flowed over the saturated cardboard and soaked right into the carpet and its pad, staining the wooden subfloor below. She was often tied up after being beaten, unable to soothe her injuries by rubbing them, as her arms were tied behind her back. Angela also hit Jeanette across the mouth with shoes, which caused serious tissue damage to her lips, which resulted in her lips healing from the inside out. The scar tissue that formed left her mouth deformed. All the while, Jeanette's stepfather Richard did absolutely nothing to stop any of this. The doctor found at least 200 injuries. She had never seen a more malnourished patient or an abuse victim with so many injuries. Jeanette also had pneumonia in the form of an abscessed lung that might have sent bacteria into her bloodstream, causing shock and death. The police discovered the room that they later dubbed the torture room, where she was beaten, and inside they found blood and human tissue splattered all over the walls. The police gathered evidence throughout the house, and they discovered that somebody had tried to destroy evidence of abuse. Among items found was the piece of cardboard placed under Jeanette as she slept on the floor to soak up the blood, and they also found a broken wooden ruler that was covered in blood, and it was thought to have been Angela's weapon of choice. 2 belts were also found that would have been used to beat Jeanette, along with jagged tree branches. The belts were almost stiff with dried blood, and the branches were stained red. At Angela's trial, her defense lawyer disgustingly said that she was not a danger to society, and her daughter died, but there was no evidence that she intended to kill her, and that if anything, she would be a victim if she was to go to prison. Yeah, imagine even thinking that, let alone saying it. Angela pleaded guilty to aggravated murder, and she was sentenced to death for the torture and murder of her daughter. She was the only woman to be sentenced to death in the state of Oregon since voters reinstated the capital punishment in 1984, until the 3rd of August in 2020, when her sentence was re-evaluated, and it was changed to life in prison. Richard McAnulty pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole until serving at least 25 years. He denied abusing Jeanette directly, but admitted that he had failed to protect her from her own mother or report the abuse to the authorities, and he has never appealed his conviction or sentence. It's unclear why Angela had such a hatred for her own flesh and blood, and it's hard to fathom how anyone could do this to an innocent person, let alone their own child. Investigators discovered that when Angela was 5 years old, her mother was murdered, and the case was never solved. She spent the remainder of her childhood living with her father and 2 brothers. Her father was also abusive, and would often withhold food from the children as a form of punishment. This is a striking resemblance to what she would later inflict upon Jeanette. I can't even begin to imagine the pain that Jeanette must have been in. Just imagine someone cutting off the skin of an infected wound, and then looking down to see your own hip bones exposed. To be neglected by your own parents must be hard enough, but for the mental and physical torture she endured for years must have been beyond excruciating. Angela is one of the few killers where it's even hard to find words to describe them. She purposefully kept her daughter on the brink of death for her own sick and twisted enjoyment.